We're talking about the cross during this season of Lent. And in fact, I just want to throw out a quick plug. We're also doing Sunday school following this sermon series. So we're talking about the cross in Sunday school, and that's kind of a chance to go more in depth and not just to have me do all the talking, but explore together what the scriptures say and what Jesus is calling us to. It's kind of a deep dive. So anybody's invited to that. We'd welcome you to be a part of that Sunday school class. And this passage today is Matthew 16. And Jesus says, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. And he says, whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for me will find it. And it's a whole passage about renunciation. It's a passage about giving up. But the way of the cross is not just renunciation. At its root, the way of the cross is about discovering who we truly are in Christ. It's about finding our identity in Him. Because you see, there are all sorts of people and institutions that will claim us for their own, but we find our truest life in Jesus. Now think about identity a little bit with me, and think about how important identity is. You know those stickers, right, that say, hello, my name is, right, and you write your name on that. And I grew up in a kind of a big church, and when we were kids, the practice in our church was we'd come in, and in the foyer, there was a table that would have these stickers and a bunch of markers, and everybody was supposed to write their name on that so that we could all know who we are. And I have no idea if churches do things like that anymore, but we'd always, every Sunday morning, that was our ritual. You'd come in, write your name on that, and slap that sticker on. Now, of course, we were a bunch of boys, a bunch of kids, and you got stickers and markers, and so we used that to mess around. I mean, my brothers did, right? But, it's like you're writing like kick me and sticking it on their back and stuff like that, right? I mean, what do you expect? But, this identity, who are you? What goes in that space, right? What do you fill in? Sometimes you'll be at a conference or something, and they'll have pre-printed ones, right? It says, who are you? Where are you from, right? What's your affiliation, right? Trying to identify you. What are you in the scheme of things? What's your identity? And I just think about how important that identity is, because we all have an identity or multiple identities. We have these different factors in who we are, these things that make us who we are. And, things that are given to us, our bodies, whether we're male or female, the families that we're born into. Some of these are unchangeable things. They identify us whether we like it or not. But there's our states, our national identity, our faith, our political affiliations, the teams we root from. I mean, those are identities too, right? And we can choose some of those things, or at least we can decide not to embrace them. If we don't like the state we are born into, we can always move somewhere else. We've got our work, we've got our hobbies, we've got our likes and our dislikes. All of these things lend us our identities. But we're more than the sum of our affiliations. I mean, there's a way in which all of these outside parties, they partly make us who we are, but we're more than that. But at the same time, they can be very strong identities. Just think about, it's kind of light, but just think about the teams that we root for. There can be a really powerful sense of identity wrapped up in this team spirit. So, Super Bowl Sunday, think about the identity, right? The Chiefs were playing, right? And me and Mateo, we took a run through town, and there's, Chiefs flags and Chiefs jerseys. It was right before the big game. Everybody's got their Chiefs stuff on. You would have had to be kind of brave to wear a 49ers t-shirt or something that weekend around here, right? Or think about like K-State versus KU. And we moved to Kansas 7 years ago. I mean, can you believe it's been that long? But we moved to Kansas 7 years ago, and I remember I couldn't keep them straight. And one of you said, well, you'll figure it out, right? Because, there's people that wear purple for everything, right? And there's people that change from red and blue to purple depending on whether it's basketball or football season. I guess that's allowed. But, even in just this kind of superficial way, right? There's these identity markers. Who are you? Purple or red and blue, right? And it really matters. And I think every state kind of has their own version of this. When I was up in Beatrice a couple of years ago, I'm doing this World Church presentation. On the second night, they had this trivia game that they made me play. And they said, who's the coach of the Huskers football team? And I gave them blank look, right? And then Pastor Brett Klingenberg asked the congregation, and the whole place erupted. Scott Frost, right? They all knew. That was part of their identity. And, they can have staying power, too, these identities. I'm coaching 5th and 6th grade indoor soccer, and we've got a couple of kids from Elyria Christian School who are playing with us, and they're the Eagles, right, at Elyria Christian School. And so every time we play a game, we put our hands together and go, 1, 2, 3, cats. And there was one kid that would always yell, Eagles. And I said, you're a cat now, man. But it was kind of funny because we're all playing on the Heston Rec team and we're in Heston Rec shirts, so I don't know what we are. But we've got these identities, right? It's part of who we are. It makes us up. And I think this is kind of what Jesus was getting at when he said, whoever wants to save his life will lose it. And whoever loses his life for me will find it, because our life is our identity. And our life is also just our life. I mean, Jesus was talking about how anyone who lays down their life for his sake, anyone who is persecuted and dies for his sake, they will receive real life, eternal life. They will be with him. That's guaranteed. And in fact, right in this passage, in this really straightforward sense, right in this passage, Jesus talked about his own death, right? And what that would mean. He said he's going to go to Jerusalem. He's going to suffer, and he's going to be killed, and he's going to be raised on the third day. And Peter, good-hearted Peter, he said, never, Lord. That will never happen to you. To which Jesus responded, get behind me, Satan. Because Jesus saw that his path would be a path of suffering, a path of giving up, that he would save the world by dying for it and being raised to new life. But even though there are believers who face persecution for their faith in Jesus all around the world, for most of us, most of the time, our lives in a literal sense are not on the line for Jesus. When Jesus says that we have to take up our cross and follow him, part of what he's telling us is that we have to be ready to go with him wherever he leads, whatever the danger. And he says in John 12, where I am, there will my servant be also. Take up your cross and follow Jesus. That means be ready to walk into the buzzsaw for him. Be ready to stake your life for him. And it also means, in just an everyday sense, when there's nothing, no danger, find your life in him. Because our life is our identity. Our life is all of those things that make us who we are, our careers and our families and those sports teams and our allegiances. That's our life. I mean, it's more than that, but that gets at our life. And Jesus is saying, whatever else might claim you, whoever else might have a stake in who you are, at the heart of it, we're all called to find our truest life in him. Jesus is saying, I should be at the heart of your self-identity. Which, sounds easy enough, right? It's just identify with Jesus. Just put Jesus at the center. Except that those other facets of our identity, they're always jostling to try to take up that center. I mean, we're always covering up those little red hello stickers. Hello, my name is. We're putting those all over the place. Hello, my name is son, daughter, mother, father, grandma, grandpa, my job, whatever it is, we're always putting those things all over ourselves, and any of those identities are trying to work their way to the middle. But as Jesus puts it, quoting Deuteronomy, when the devil tempts him back in the desert, Jesus says, man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. We're always more than just what we eat, just those basic things of life. We require so much more to be fully and completely alive, to be a true human being in the eyes of God. And that's where our identity comes in. And it turns out that those things that we identify, that identify us, they can become temptations. And I think that's part of what is going on in that story when the devil comes and tempts Jesus in the desert. I mean, the devil comes to him and tells him to turn the bread to stone. And then the devil takes him up a high mountain and tells him that all Jesus has to do is worship him, and the devil will grant Jesus all the kingdoms of the world. And then the devil takes him to the top of the temple and says, throw yourself down, the angels will scoop you up. And all three of those temptations are really central to Jesus' identity. Each of them represents the possibility of Jesus going a different route, setting himself above the will of the Father, making God conform to his wishes rather than submitting himself to God's plan. Will he face his own hunger by waiting out those 40 days? Will he become the Lord of the world by the cross or by the usual earthly levers of power? Will he put God to the test, or will he submit himself to God? The devil was tempting Jesus with this alternative identity, this alternative life. Who will he become? What will he choose? Where will Jesus find his life? And each of us has those alternative identities that are trying to claim us, and it's way more than the color of jerseys that we'll wear. It's about how we define ourselves. Will it be family or political party? Will it be nationalism or careerism? Will it be success or money or fame? What will define us? And our identities will determine the kinds of choices we'll make and how we'll live out our lives. They will be temptations. Don't doubt their power. The devil didn't come to Jesus in an out-and-out attack. He wasn't the great dragon who tried to come and destroy Jesus. The devil came quietly. He sidled up to him. I kind of imagine that scene in the desert. I imagine the devil kind of putting his arm around Jesus. I imagine him whispering, "Hey, Jesus, why should the Son of Man have to die?" Receive that as a warning. Peter said that the devil is like a roaring lion prowling about looking for someone to devour, but a lot of times before the devil roars, he comes up to our ears and he purrs. And nowhere is this more true than how we define ourselves. Do we define ourselves first and foremost as Americans so that then we feel we don't need to concern ourselves with citizens of other countries? Or you may have noticed that this is an election year. Do we identify ourselves with one political party and thus despise people who might see things differently than we do? And I'm not just talking about civility. It's kind of this preacherly sort of thing to say that we all need to be more civil. But what I'm talking about is that our root feelings, right? Our root feelings toward people who vote differently than us, or people who make us mad because they do or they say things that we don't like. Maybe they make us mad because they kneel during the national anthem. You may have heard about identity politics, right? And identity politics is what happens when people start to identify themselves in very narrowly and exclusively, in ways that are very narrow and exclusive over and against others. So, an easy one is like gun owners versus non-gun owners. And certain politicians are really good at playing at our basest fears of the other and getting people to define themselves over and against other people. So vote for us. We've got to stick together. People who think differently from us, they don't just disagree. They are misled, or they're stupid, or they are evil. And so, this is a pretty straightforward place when we hear that kind of message, or even sometimes internalize that. It's a pretty straightforward place where how we identify ourselves will determine how we act, right? How do we talk about people who are different from us or who hold views that are opposed to ours? How do we think about them? Our thoughts, our actions, our deeds, they're going to reveal something about where our identity really lies. Or what about other identities that are more subtle? I wonder for how many of us it's important to project an identity of success, right? Success. We've worked hard. We've studied. We've made it big in some way. At least we've made our mark on the world. We're successful. So, I don't know. Does that identify you, or is that a lure for you? And I'll tell you, a lot of pastors can get trapped in this, right? We can easily identify ourselves by success. And for pastors, success often equates with church size. So you go to these pastors' gatherings, and you talk to pastors, and you say, "Hey, how's your church doing?" And there will be people who will respond how it's growing or how there's these new folks, but sometimes churches don't grow numerically, and that can be tough for some pastors, and it can cause a lot of anxieties. Honestly, I've seen pastors at some of these gatherings brought to tears by the struggle of maintaining that self-image of this successful, got-it-together pastor of a growing church. Stephen Whitmer, this individual, he's a small-town pastor from Massachusetts. He's got a recent book out on the rural church, and there's a moment in his book where he does this kind of Jeff Foxworthy thing. Do you remember Jeff Foxworthy? It's like, you might be a redneck if. Anyway, Pastor Whitmer says something. You might be a rural pastor if, and one of the things he says, you might be a rural pastor if you've ever included babies in utero when you're doing your church count, talking to other pastors, right? So, it can really cause some stress for people, right? And this image of success, this idea of success, does it grab hold of your identity? And I'll just be honest, that's a temptation for me. Every once in a while, somebody will shoot me an email and they'll say, thanks for your book, that really helped me, or whatever. And I'll tell you, I just spoon that stuff right up, right? I just take that right to heart. I sing myself a little song about how now my life matters because I wrote this book that helps someone. So I count for someone. I count for something. And see, now I tell you about it so that you can kind of affirm me and validate my identity. But what is that for you, right? What is that thing that you place right at the center that makes you who you are, that gives you your life? What is that for you? Because in one way, Jesus isn't calling us to anything heroic. He's not just speaking the naked truth about whoever wants to save his life will lose it. I mean, he's not just saying that. He's not calling to something heroic. We cannot hold on to all those things that we try to place at the center. The kids are going to move away. The spouse will die. The book becomes yesterday's news. The business climate changes and success slips away. All flesh is like grass, says the Apostle Peter. Or Psalm 90, our lives are like a dream, like grass that is renewed in the morning. Jesus is saying, look, you can't hang on to it, but what's going to be at the center of your identity? Because all those other things will pass away. But Jesus has good news in that statement. And the good news is the second part. Whoever loses his life for me will find it. Whenever we voluntarily lay aside our claims to greatness, our claims to importance, our identity in something else other than Jesus, we find, and this is impossible, this is paradoxical, we find that we're not left with nothing. We give it all away, and we find that we're left with Jesus. And Jesus himself modeled this self-giving life in his ministry. He had this very clear sense of himself, this very lucid understanding of his own boundaries. But his life was a model of love for others, right? He demonstrated healing. He showed us what it looks like to really listen. He was humble. He was willing to associate with those that society looked down upon. He was completely open to the will of God, whatever that would look like. He knew it ended in his suffering and death, but he still stuck to that path. Father, not my will, but yours be done. Because just as Jesus had rejected the devil's offer at the beginning of his ministry, the whole world handed to him on a platter in exchange for worship, so he continued to reject anything that took him away from his Father. He showed us what it means to keep the first things first. And for Jesus, that was the salvation of the world. And for us, it will start with the salvation of our own souls. So he says in that passage, verse 28, he says, or verse 26, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world but to lose his soul? And the reality is that people sell their souls, figuratively, if not literally, all the time, right? Sell their souls. We've all seen it. I don't have to go into the ugly details. People will shortchange their deepest values and their convictions in order to get ahead in something. But there is nothing that will matter more to us than our souls. And in part, that's because eternity lasts forever, and the things of this world pass away. And we want to be seeking God above all else, seeking our salvation. But also because there is nothing else in this world that will satisfy in the end, nothing else beyond knowing God. It is only in grounding ourselves in him that we'll find what we're really looking for. And eternity is Jesus' time frame. This is why he says in verse 27, he said that the Son of Man will come with his angels, right? He will judge each according to what they have done. It is in finding our life in him that we will receive our reward. Not the things of the world, but treasure in heaven. Not luxury and power, but holiness, love, and grace. And ultimately, God himself. And the horizon of eternity is always drawing near. Verse 28, he says that there are those who are standing here who will not taste death until the Son of Man returns in power. And this is a challenging verse because it sounds like Jesus expected the fullness of the kingdom to come within the lifetime of those who heard him speaking. And perhaps he referred to the resurrection, which would usher in the kingdom. Perhaps Jesus was talking about the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, some 40 years after his death, and for all the changes that would come with it. But the urgency is the same urgency we see in the prophets and the apostles. Always be ready. Always keep awake. The kingdom is coming. The way of the cross that Jesus taught and lived is this way of reversal. But it's not turning the world upside down. Get this. The way of the cross is a way of right-siding our lives. It's putting what matters on top. It's putting Jesus at the center and finding our truest life in him. And everything else, all our other identities, they'll fall away, but our identity in Jesus will endure till eternity. Now think about the Apostle Paul. There he was, the Apostle Paul, right? He's this young man who is scary smart. He had all the training and the credentials, and he finds himself knocked upside the head by Jesus on the road to Damascus. And the question for him really becomes, now what? The question really is how he's going to live his life in light of Jesus. And he comes to this conclusion. Paul says, I regard everything as lost because of the surpassing value of knowing Christ my Lord. He says, it is no longer I who live, but it is Christ who lives in me. He says, for me to live is Christ, and for me to die is gain. And all that he is, all of those titles and degrees, every hello, my name is sticker that Paul had on his tunic, everything that he is becomes subsumed into his identity in Jesus. And this isn't just something that happens once and then we're kind of done and we get on with life. Losing our life to Jesus and finding it in him is going to be an ongoing journey. I think about the late, great Eugene Peterson. And he tells the story how, as a young pastor, he was tasked with starting this new Presbyterian church in a growing suburb in Maryland. And Pastor Peterson, he got people together. They started meeting in his basement, and it grew. It took off. People were energized. They got big enough that they went and they bought land, and they built a church. And after all of that, the people, he noticed, started to trickle off. Some of his pillar folks who had been very energized didn't show up on Sunday. And it seemed like once the excitement of being part of something new wore off, they just went fishing or something. And some of them quit attending altogether. And so Peterson really questioned who he was and what he was doing there. He entered into a time in his life that he calls the Badlands. Peterson relates how he called up his supervisor at the denominational headquarters, and he said, well, what should I do? This is what's happening, and people are trickling off. And his supervisor told him that what he should do is start another building project right away to keep people engaged. But he didn't really like that idea, so he kind of resisted that. He felt, his role as a pastor was to help people to grow into their identity in Christ. That was his identity. And it took him a long time to kind of figure out what it would mean and how he would carry it out. He had to recenter his vocation and his identity and his life in Jesus. Well, Jesus' call to find our truest life in him is actually a very deep biblical call. And it tracks back to the ultimate question of who we are before God. Think of Psalm 8. What are human beings that you are mindful of them? What are mortals that you care for them? Who are we? What does it mean who are we meant to be? What does it mean to be ourselves? Jesus is saying that all the possible identities that we might stick on ourselves, all the names that we might give ourselves, at some level, those never really exhaust who we are. All of those identities never really get to the heart of our life. So who are we? Well, this is the other message that is hidden, that's always hidden in the cross. When Jesus said, take up our cross and follow him, he's calling us. It's this challenge. But we shouldn't miss out on the fact that Jesus is inviting us to something good. The cross is a signpost of God's love. And when we hear Jesus saying, take up your cross and follow me, we shouldn't just hear a challenge. We should also hear the meaning of the cross, which is this. God loved us so much that he gave himself for us. Jesus took up the cross for us. Jesus died for us. And in God's eyes, that means we are worth dying for. Which is to say that we are beloved of God. We are called by God. We are those whom God desires to be in communion with. Who are we? We are those beloved by God, and that is something. And here's the surprising thing. When we lose our life to find it in Jesus, we don't actually lose all those other identities that define us. We may still have those hello, my name is stickers that say father, mother, son, daughter, writer, worker, teacher, healer, whatever it is. But those identities will take on a new meaning in Christ. All of those other competing identities will fall into place with Christ at the center. And just as we become ourselves in Jesus, those identities find their fullness in God's ultimate gifting, which is grace, God's love expressed in our creation and birth and life. Jesus shows us what this looks like. Remember that he launched his ministry with the time in the desert in the presence of God, tempted by the devil. But Jesus doesn't stay out there in that desert. Who he is and what he will become can't happen in a desert vacuum. And so he bests the devil and then heads straight back into Galilee, where he's immediately up to his ears in relationships and work. And it's in Galilee that he lives out his calling as the Son of Man, sent to save the world. But he's able to live out his other identities because he has been so thoroughly grounded by that time in the desert in his bedrock relationship to his Father. In Book 1 of his Confessions, St. Augustine writes about how God led him and has gifted him with so much, not least his incredible writing and intellectual abilities. God made him who he is. At the end of that book, Augustine offers up this little prayer. It's a prayer that describes how whatever gifts God has given him, whatever matters most, whatever is the giftedness of his life, it is ultimately all found in God. And Augustine prays this: "My God, thanks be to you for your gifts, but you must preserve them for me, and by doing this you will preserve me. And what you have given me will grow and come to fulfillment, and I will be with you, because it was your gift that I exist at all." Us too. Amen.